Well, welcome everyone. Can you hear me? No? Yes? Okay. Well, hello. That you don't want to hear. So I'm Sue Dixon. I'm here with two hats, Shelburne Farms and All Souls Interfaith Gathering, which are two of the sponsors of tonight's conversation series. The other sponsors are the Shelburne Museum, of course, and this beautiful Pizzagelli Center where we're meeting tonight for what is turning out to be the first of a series of 3 conversations. And we didn't have to brave a snowstorm and strap on our, mucklocks and boots to get here tonight. So the 2 conversations, this was supposed to be the final conversation. So you never know what you're going to find. This is the first conversation. And we hope you will join us, enjoy tonight's conversation, which Fran will introduce our guests, and you'll also enjoy the subsequent ones that have been postponed from the snowy March that we've had. But the other sponsors are Pierson Library in Shelburne and RETN, who is filming this for Channel 16. We're so grateful. And in addition, this year, the Vermont Humanities Council has sponsored this event. So we thank all of those sponsors, and we thank you for being here, because the series this year is about engaging in conversation across difference. And I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to figure out that this is important, that we be figuring out how we can engage in a meaningful dialogue with those that may think a little differently than ourselves, because that's really where the richness of being human is. So we're so grateful to you, Fran, for, I think this is our 7th year partnering with you. Could that
Yeah,
be?
6 or 7.
Are you starting to itch? You know? And so if you don't mind, you can introduce our guests, and we so appreciate all that you do to enrich our communities with conversation.
Thank you so much, Sue. So it's so great that this is spring equinox, so happy spring, everybody, and it is also the United Nations International Day of Forests. And we have 2 amazing men who know the forest very well. So I think this is very appropriate for our discussion about a relationship with nature and what that's all about. So again, this was going to be the final one, because the other ones are relationship across difference. So one was around relationships with different religions. So that's going to be April 11th now. Or no, that's going to be next week, the 28th. And the other is a relationship across difference, human to human. So that could be race, that could be disabilities, that could be, any number of things. And we have 2 fabulous mediators, one is in the audience tonight, who are going to be our guests for that one on April 11th. So this just seems, it really was a theme that was kind of a no-brainer this year. All of those organizations that Sue mentioned have people who are part of a committee that make these conversations happen and come up with a theme and come up with who we're going to choose to talk about these things. And it's really an opportunity to go a little bit deeper. And we certainly engage the audience. So those of you that have been here before, thank you for coming back. Those of you that are new, we'll have a conversation up here, and then we'll open it up to the audience. And we hope that you really participate. And so think of questions that are coming up for you as we have these discussions. There is a great quote by Fritjof Capra that reminds us that understanding life requires a shift of focus from objects to relationships. And I just kind of loved that quote also for what we're doing. And today we're looking at the relationship with nature, with 2 men who are very connected to the natural world and have helped many others find their own connection to that. And I'm sure they will continue to do that today. So let me introduce them, and then we'll start our conversation. Steve Parker is the owner and manager of High Reach Farm, a diversified tree farm in Danville, Vermont. He has been working on sustainable land and forestry practices since 1976, when he returned to Vermont to manage the family farm with pesticide and herbicide-free practices. Steve and his wife Susan developed an integrated approach to public conflict, which grew out of concepts and principles of nature and sustainable land management. Steve was on the Danville Select Board for 11 years, 6 of which he was chair, God bless you, and was also town administrator for 2 years. So a broad experience there for Steve. Duncan Murdoch grew up on the shores of Lake Champlain right here in rural Vermont, where his deep connection to nature was formed. He went to New York City to seek a career as an actor, but took a different turn. After receiving guide certification from the Association of Nature and Forest Therapy Guides and Programs, he began his official practice in New York City by guiding the first forest bathing groups through Central Park. He also created New York City's first Shinrin-yoku trail, well, I got that, on Randall's Island there. Duncan has moved back to Vermont, where he now hosts walks throughout the state with his organization, Nature Connection Guide. So that's who we're speaking with tonight. And I'm going to start with your earliest memory of experiencing the earth or nature as an entity to kind of engage in. Do you want to start us off, Steve?
Is this working, and can you hear me? All right, good. To both. I'm trying to recall if there was one experience or if it wasn't sort of a composite, but my folks moved us to this little hill farm in the Northeast Kingdom in North Danville in 1953 when I was 3 years old. And I had this immediate sense of a tremendous power or energy in the landscape. And when you're 3, you don't necessarily articulate these things, you just feel them. But that was imprinted on me very early, and I was an outdoor boy. I was a bit of an introvert and a bit of a loner, even though I had siblings. I spent a lot of time by myself outdoors day and night, and everything from the full moon rising and just the spectacular beauty of this thing coming up over the edge of the landscape to walking from the farmhouse to the barn in wintertime, and I was a very small little boy, and there was a path shoveled that was like a tunnel. You know, the snow was 4 or 5 feet high on either side, and it was sort of the barn was a little bit like Noah's Ark. You know, you were just holding your breath until you got to the barn. And there was something about winters in the 1950s. They were very extreme, and the wind just blew tremendously hard. And our road was lined with sugar maples that had been there for 200 years. And just the sound of the winter wind blowing snow through those bare limbs left a big impression on me. And then you'd get to the barn, and you'd swing the door open, and you'd walk inside, and you were indoors again, and there was just the smell of animals coming to you, the smell and the sounds of the horses, the work horses that were in the stall just to the right, and the cattle, and these big gray barn spiders that continued to work, do their thing right through the winter. So those are just some of the pictures and images.
Thanks. I'm sure you've taken us all kind of there for our moment or our own. And your earliest memory of experiencing kind of earth or nature as a entity?
Yeah, I love that question because it's something I ask people about, and it often brings you right there. And it's so my earliest experience was growing up right over there on Lake Champlain, and I would follow these paths through the forest that were made by, of course, gnomes, and I would follow these paths, and I'd be like, oh, where are they going? And it would go right up along the slate rock cliffs right on the shore there. And there would be these big trees that I didn't know at the time were the big cedars, and they had the root system kind of tumbling down and curling in and making these homes for the gnomes. And I would just walk through these trails, every day, and that's one of my earliest memories. It was really magical.
Okay. So the next one is to talk about, and you turned me on to this, Steve, this genius loci, this spirit of place, the genius of place. What does that mean to you, and how do you experience that?
Is it a term that you're familiar with? The spirit of place is in the English language, but it actually originates in Latin, although I suspect that it goes back prior to Latin, and it's genius loci in Latin. And I guess I think of it as the capacity of nature to instruct those people who are willing to be apprenticed to nature, that there is a willingness that is embedded in nature to communicate to the people who wish to listen. And that's just something that I experience on a regular basis. And the phrase is lengthened sometimes to tutelary genius of place. Tutelary means instructive or teaching. And that just kind of fills out the meaning of it a little bit. And we tend to think of nature as being a sort of a passive thing that receives whatever hand we human beings deal to it. And this just indicates that it's a very different matter and that there is intelligence there which is embedded in that living entity.
And Duncan, how would you see nature how does nature inform us about who we are and how we should act, kind of in following?
Yeah, I see it as something. Well, I just thought of the quote that you mentioned in the beginning of seeing objects rather than seeing objects. You focus on relationships, but I see it also as kind of seeing objects, having relationships with those objects, which aren't really objects at all. Those are beings and species. So transferring that, like these flowers, those aren't objects. That's not those are beings, and those are right now living flowers. So it's like that I see as, rather than objects, relationships with beings that you can interact with, and that's something that I like to focus on.
So if we interact, how do you communicate or connect with nature? And we'll get to both of you with this one, because I think this is the heart of this matter. And I might have to borrow your microphone, and you might have to share this one. I think this one just went out. I was a little worried about the batteries, but this one's still working. Sorry about that. You can see maybe we can do something about it.
So the question of how we communicate, yeah, it's
How do you do it? How do you communicate? How do you connect? Maybe I'll just speak up.
It's a really big question, and I think that the thinkers about ecology and agriculture that I most admire talk about farming as a conversation with the land, or a conversation with the landscape. And that's meaningful to me, even though there isn't a specific vocabulary such as you and I might share in a conversation we have. There's a kind of a larger vocabulary which to me includes behaviors and actions. And when I'm thinking about doing something or making a change or an alteration in a piece of landscape, I'll often just go and sit there and sort of think out in my mind what it is I'm contemplating, and basically say, well, what do you think of that? And just kind of put it out in that sort of way and just let it go. And sometimes I'll just get up and take a walk, and I won't necessarily obsess about the question, but just pay attention to what seems to happen as I'm taking the walk. There's a lot more to be said about that, but I think I'll leave it at that for now. And
We will certainly get back to that, but
Yeah.
your first take on...
How do we connect? Yeah. Well, I think we all, I think we all know how to connect, like in our own way, especially people I think who have come here with this nature as their guide as a topic. You all are probably really interested in this and already have your own intimate connection with nature. So, I mean, and I think the ways that we all connect are just spending time in nature and just really, that's really, I think, the biggest step is intentionally making an action to connect and to notice new things. And then just the rest comes with that, just putting yourself in the place to observe and to create your own relationship, you know, through time and as things evolve, you know, through the seasons. So it's really just putting yourself there and listening and being there and experiencing nature through all of the senses.
So let's keep going a little deeper there. Oh, you know, maybe, I don't know what this is. Am I pushing something wrong? Okay, well, I'll use this just for the RETN. I'm not sure. I'll continue to play with that. So one thing, Steve, you had written is that you come to know an ecosystem, that you need to come to know your system. What does it mean to engage with the land as a farmer? So you moved into organic. What are you noticing, listening for? What happened there with that whole transition?
It's a good question. Well, actually, it's something I don't really talk about very much because in many ways I think of myself as a scientific person in the sense that I'm very interested in how things actually work, including living systems, ecosystem plants, and how the actions that I undertake actually work and the kinds of results that they bring. And so I tend to be very cumulative in my observations. I'll do certain kinds of practices or work, and then for years afterwards, on a regular basis, I'll walk those landscapes that I've done work and look to see how the landscape is talking back to me. But in another sense, there's a part of my view and my approach to landscape, for want of a better word, you could say it was kind of mystical. And there was a period of time when, you know, I was really kind of carrying out a study of shamanism and shamanic practices, a little bit less so as I've gotten older, although I think a lot of those insights have gotten kind of embedded in how I look at my farm. But my wife is away on a trip one weekend, and she called me on a Sunday and said, well, how's your weekend going? And I said, well, it's been an interesting weekend. I've decided not to use herbicides and pesticides anymore and figure out how to grow Christmas trees organically. And she said, oh, well, that's interesting. Do you know how you're going to do it? And I said, no, I haven't got the slightest idea. But I had done this journey where I had just gotten this very strong message. It's time to give that up. That you're exercising power in a way that's unfair and inequitable and harmful, and you need to figure out another way to do it. So I have to tell you I feel like I'm kind of going out on a limb here and telling you a very weird story. But I took to walking through my Christmas tree fields, or fields that were going to be Christmas tree fields, and I felt like, in one sense, a complete idiot, but I thought, what the hell, I'm going to try it. And so I'd walk through the field and I'd say, okay, here's what I want to do. I want to plant Christmas trees, and this is going to become a kind of a miniature forest. And I want you all to help me with this transition and teach me what I need to know in order to bring this about. And I got to the top of the field, And the trees were already growing there, in neat little rows. And I sat down on the bench, and it just popped into my head to say, I realize that when I'm asking you to do this, I'm asking you to make a sacrifice, and I need to make a sacrifice as well. And as soon as I said it, my nose started bleeding. So I stood up, and the field that I was looking at, the rows were going this way. So I started walking downhill through the field, which meant I crossed every single row of Christmas trees. And every time I crossed a row of Christmas trees, a drop of blood would come out of my nose. And it was very awkward because, usually it just dribbles down the front of you and stains your pants. But so I was leaning forward, so that didn't happen. So each drop of blood would hit the ground. And I was moving along pretty fast. And when I got to the 44th row, which was at the bottom of the field, and reached the road, the nosebleed stopped.
Wow. No fainting. It's great. So let's then talk about how you help people listen and engage through force therapy. So what is it, and what do you do? Why do people need a guide?
Yeah. So I lead forest bathing walks, and that's based off of Shinrin-yoku, which is a Japanese practice that's translated literally as forest bathing, or taking in the forest atmosphere. And this practice was established in Japan in 1982 in response to the population's levels of stress, and to kind of address this issue that people were overworked, and it was starting to really affect people's health as a nation. So it was created in response to that. And so they're like, oh, how are we gonna respond to this? They said, okay, let's do this forest bathing thing, which is essentially taking leisurely walks in the forest for your own health and well-being. This really took off in Japan, and it has then spread to Korea, and then it's sat there for maybe over 20 years until recently the Western world kind of started to pay attention to this, mostly through the scientific research that has gone behind it about backing up these claims that nature is good for you. Which we all kind of innately know, right? But for the pragmatic among us need this kind of justification to carve out time in your day as part of a wellness practice to go into the forest or go into nature, to relax and de-stress and unplug, and really give yourself the opportunity to slow down and be in nature with no other agenda than just experiencing nature through this kind of mindfulness technique, which is just noticing actively and with intention, noticing new things. So really, it's different. People ask, why do you need a guide for this, right? I can go off into the woods alone and have this nature experience, which you can, yeah, absolutely. So how it's different though is this is kind of like it's a guided experience. So it's like a guided meditation if you're doing meditation, or it's like a yoga class. You can do your own practice, but having an instructor there guiding you through new poses or just pacing yourself through the experience. And also what's really cool with this, I think we all have this personal connection to nature, this individual, private connection that I think we've all experienced, especially as children. We're just going off and having these adventures, all alone. This is all your experience. What's really cool about this is we do this in groups. So the practice has these council circles. So we all have an experience. I offer an invitation, which is a time to focus in on one sense for a period of like 20 minutes or something to really sink into, say, the sense of hearing. And then you go off and you have this time where you're just listening, just really, really listening to the birds and the wind. And then we all come back together and we share this experience together. And there's a real power in talking, just like now, talking together about the things we really, really care about and the experiences that we have in nature. Sharing that as a group is where the hearts just, from in my experience with the groups that I've had, your heart's really open, and it's just it's an incredible experience that I have with people on these walks.
And Steve, you also, High Reach Farm is also a teaching and learning and gathering space. So you have also had programs with people. Do you have kind of a goal of your programs when people have come there, or just quickly just to kind of connect that you both are helping people connect to nature on some level? But I don't really know about your programs.
Well, there are different objectives. Some of them are really instructional, on tree farming practices, but more and more. Susan and I just renovated the farmhouse, and we rent it out to families and groups that are vacationing. And it's interesting because in a way it's a very hopeful view of America, because the families, the people who come are just great. They're great people. But they're coming almost always from a very urban setting, and they're moving very fast, physically and mentally. They're what I call their on clock time. They're very much on clock time. And the hope is that we can get them a little more on dream time, slow down a little bit, let things come to you, and then instead of you always trying to go towards whatever you want. And typically, they're young families with young children, and they're very consumed with worry that their children are going to get bored because they don't have enough activities. So we provide them with brochures and leaflets about Santa's Village and Storyland and Ben and Jerry's and how we make cider and all that. So they go off on road trips, but they tend to move very fast, and they tend to be there for only 2 or 3 days because that's the time they have. And typically when they leave, they say, well, we hate to go. We feel like we're just now getting here. And I said, yes, that's probably true. Next year you'll have to come back for a week. But we have a lot of roads and trails that ribbon out through, the tree farm, through open land and through wooded land, and up to a pond where there are wild ducks that are swimming around and feeding. And what I try to do is to create this kind of winding, circuitous path where you can't see too far ahead. You have to experience things a step at a time as you go, and then suddenly you've got this spectacular view across the valley, and there are places to sit and just be and take things in. And some places invite inspiration, some invite contemplation, or introverted going in and being with your own thoughts, or sitting beside water, or different kinds of moods, which sounds very much like what you're doing. And it's not kind of didactic. We're not saying you must do this, because I think everybody's process as they go through this is very individual. Even if you're traveling as a group, everybody is going through their own set of experiences. In a group of 20 people, you may be walking the same landscape, but you're experiencing that through the filter of your own life and your own personal lens and your experiences. And hopefully things are happening for you, and things are speaking to you in a way that has meaning for you.
Great. Now, I've come to a place where I've got a whole nother page of questions. But is anyone burning with a question right now? And we will get to a conversation. Yeah.
Yes, I found gnomes.
Fantastic. You know, the other thing,
Yep. Yeah, it's your own personal gnome.
Do they all wear green hats or what?
The green, there's green, you got options. Green, brown, red.
and more than in just March.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, year round.
Are gnomes the same thing as menahunis?
Don't know what that manhuni is.
It's a Hawaiian.
Oh, a creature? A nature creature? Yeah, probably the same. Same thing.
Wow.
Yeah.
Who knew we would go off to gnomes? It's all good. It's all good. And actually, this is from the sublime to something else. But one thing I realized that a lot of Vermonters, I think there is a real connection. That's a lot of reason why we're here. Though I think we're hungry for even more all the time. And I think we also, many of us have felt a kind of grief in the face of climate change and the destruction of forests and other environments to make way for people and profit. You know, it can feel overwhelmed. We've lost touch, and so much of the world has lost touch. Kind of how do you cope with these modern realities as people who are really close? And you know, how did we all lose touch?
Yeah, I mean, I try to allow myself to experience the range of emotions, right? And it's like there's anger for me, there's outrage, but a layer below that, there's grief. There's deep grief and sadness that I experience. And I think maybe some of you experience knowing the impact that humans are having on a massive scale on the world. Humans have always been pretty reckless, and we've driven many species to extinction throughout our time as humans, but at this scale is like, it's incredible. So part of how I deal with it is communing with nature and experiencing that, allowing myself to experience that grief in nature, and being open to nature's giving and healing abilities. Nature has been always giving to us, giving, and we've been taking, but now it's time for some reciprocity. Now it's time for a relationship and an understanding that we have that everything is interconnected. And we've experiencing this in our own technology. You know, we're all connected on some level, and that doesn't just apply to the internet and to our own communication with our own species, but it applies to nature and the world, and we're understanding trees are communicating with each other. They're all connected with the mycorrhizal network. So we're beginning to understand. You take out one species from the landscape, there's a cascading effect, right? Not only in just keystone species, but yeah, you never know what a keystone species really is. A keystone species is one that if you take out from the environment, then it's just like this ripple effect throughout the world, really. So.
And you feel people are beginning to really understand that on a more profound level.
I
We
think
realize
so.
we've kind of hit a wall here
Yeah.
that is threatening us
Yes.
as well as nature.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, of course, humans. It's only until it affects us that we're really starting to understand. But that's the tragedy of it. But it's also our saving grace, is that this is starting to affect us. Never mind, it's been affecting all the other species that live on this planet. It's not only us, you know, but now that it's affecting us, we're starting to, there's awakening happening, there's a movement happening, a revolution happening that I believe that we're starting to understand this. So I think for me it's anger, it's grief, and then it's this communing and this unification to address this problem.
Steve, I can see you nodding a lot. Something to
Right.
add there?
Well, I have a parallel set of thoughts out of my own experience running alongside of this that's based on my life of growing up on a pretty tired out hill farm that had been cleared of the forest, about 200 years ago, and grew sheep, merino sheep, in the early 1800s until about the time of the Civil War, and then the process of abandonment began because many of the young folks who went off to fight either did not return because the West was opening up and the fertile prairies were beginning to be farmed, but the forest began to return, and that's what it's been doing for 150 years now. And I've been on this piece of land for over 60 years, actually, and seen much, much more of that process happening. So in human terms, it's been a process of abandonment and loss and attrition and tragedy. In ecological terms, I've had a chance to witness the landscape putting itself back together again, and it began to become obvious to me, both through observation and through study of ecology and forestry, that nearly all landscapes have built into them their own self-reconstructing processes. If you go away and leave them alone, or if you exist on them in sympathy, they start to put themselves back together again. And there's a tremendous amount to be learned to some extent, letting them take the lead in the dance. And so that it becomes possible to start to contemplate a different basis for farming, or what we've thought of as agriculture and forestry for 10,000 years, which is basically stopping or interrupting or suppressing the natural processes of the landscape and replacing them with high-speed, simplified versions to produce crops. And you do that at great expense to the landscape over time. So I've been sort of involved in the exercise and in the practice of trying to redesign an agriculture and a forestry that uses that, what we call the succession process. That's the energy that drives the farming process as well, so that farming it begins to operate in a symbiotic relationship with the landscape's own self-reassembly, self-healing, self-reconstructing process.
I think when we talked earlier, you talked about, just as in human, if you repress thoughts or memories, or it's going to pop back up in an uglier way, in a way. And I think you talked about that, that basic principle of nature that applies to humans when you restored the deer yard.
Yes.
So could you just tell us that story?
You folks are probably familiar with the term deer yard. It's this far north, the white-tailed deer, especially in the Northeast Kingdom with deep snows, has trouble getting through the winter because of deep snows and lack of cover. So they tend to yard up, to group together and inhabit dense evergreen thickets. And there are particular areas where they tend to go and tend to congregate, and the climate it's a little bit like being inside a barn for cattle in the wintertime. There's much less wind, there's much less loss of warmth, up through the air because you've got a canopy overhead, and most particularly, the snow isn't nearly as deep, so it's easier to get around. So that's a particular type of softwood forest that I'm interested in recreating, partly because it's beneficial for a tree farmer if it's managed properly, but also because it sustains these wildlife populations. But when I came back to manage the farm, these these were mostly stands of cedar. They were over-mature, over-aged, and they were all starting to blow over because the root systems are very shallow. So we'd have a whole block of cedars that would fall over, and we'd go in and harvest them, which is not an easy job because they're all like fiddlesticks interwoven with each other. And when you get done, you think, well, there's no trees here. You know, how do we reforest this with the right species that will be suitable habitat for winter habitat for white-tailed deer? And I was thinking, well, we're going to have to just dig up cedar trees and start planting them here. And I realized that was a hopeless task. It was just a huge area. And so one spring, I took a walk through the landscape and I heard the splashing of water, and I walked further, and it was this enormous beaver pond that had been built with a huge long dam that crossed the floodplain and had created acres of land underwater. And I noticed that the beavers were grazing where we had cleaned up the cedar blowdown because it had all grown up to hardwoods. Now, beavers will not eat evergreens. They don't like them at all. They'll only graze hardwoods and brambles and hardwood deciduous shrubs. So they were clearing all of this out of the landscape, and you could see these little cedar trees popping up everywhere. And after about 5 years, you had a young cedar forest that was about this high. So I thought, well, what if I go up? The beavers have removed almost all of their food supply because they'll only go a certain distance away from the stream to drag, back to the dam. So if I went upstream and I harvested another 5 acres of cedar and wait a few years, maybe they'll move in and go to work on that. They'll treat that harvested patch like a pasture and remove all the deciduous trees, and the cedars will take over. And it very quickly began to work out, and I could see that it was working beautifully. So I just would go from one side of the stream to the other and harvest these patches that would come right up to the edge of the stream. And you could see they make these little canals, actually, because they prefer to move wood in the water rather than dragging it across the land. And these little canals sort of finger out into the floodplain, and it's just an amazing process to watch happening, and their capacity for building walls is unbelievable. But the perfection with which this natural, self-interested process began to rebuild the landscape in exactly the suitable way, it made a big impression on me. And I said, well, it's almost like you flip a switch and nature starts doing it for you rather than you killing yourself trying to do it yourself. And I thought, well, this can probably be replicated in case after case, and maybe this is more what my farming should be about, is learning how these processes can be set in motion by the cast of characters that's out there, rather than me taking on the lonely, desperate task of trying to do it all myself.
Yeah, you're really working with the beaver
Yeah.
and the deer. And so another thing I'm wondering, when we're getting in touch with nature, another thing that hit me, are we getting in touch with our wild self? That wildness. We're mainly talking about very gentle, very quiet things. Do you get into the wild aspect at all with your work?
Yeah, a little bit, more of the playful part. But the walks, yeah, we experiment with playing with our edge, which is our edge of comfort. So, but I would like to delve into, with the walks that I do, tapping into the wild side. But I think, yeah, connecting to your inner nature is very. I mean, it's a perfect analogy there. You're connecting to nature, but in essence, you're connecting to your inner nature. So.
And giving yourself time to do that. You're listening inside as well as outside, it seems.
Yeah, but the thing is, we're all one. So when you get to that level, it's like we're not listening out or in, we're listening as one, because we are nature, you know?
Beautiful. Yeah. Which, two more thoughts. One, both of you have worked with communities, and certainly as a rural town official in Danville, just how do the residents in the Northeast Kingdom, you know, what is their relationship with the land, with wildlife, with community? Does attending, sorry, I'm kind of almost doing two questions here, but does attending to the land make you more involved in your community? How does it connect you to community? You're a loner, and yet it seems that both of you have a sense of community that's more profound than many.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. For me, I don't know if I could generalize about it. I know that for me it has been a basis of connecting with the community, and it's provided the community. In a certain sense, if you're a public official, it helps a lot if people can see you as the public official and fit you into a category that they're familiar with, that has meaning and importance to them. And they can say, oh yeah, he's a farmer, he works with trees, and we go out and we get Christmas trees. And so that is it's a point of familiarity and connection between them and me that can become the basis of trust. And Danville happens to have 2 town forests, and nothing was done on them for long periods of time. So I decided, well, one of the things I want to do as a public official is begin to do some work in those town forests. And we started thinning out some plantations and harvesting some, really crowded, doing selective harvests of crowded pine stands. And we brought in a portable bandsaw mill, and we milled out all the lumber to build a new town garage and to do a much needed renovation of the town hall, and an addition on the fire station, and to build booths at the baseball fields for the clubs to sit in. So it was both stewardship and improvement of forests that were town property, but it was also processing that material in a way that got poured back into the community in a way that brought buildings and infrastructure to life.
And they feel very connected
Yeah.
with that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think,
Duncan.
community is incredibly important, and that's part of the reason why I moved back to my home state is to have that sense of community and family, and a community that it comes together around issues that are important to me. So I am, in my own life, building my own community and understanding the incredible importance community has in wellness, and that's one of the major players in being a gauge of happiness is, do you feel isolated, or do you feel alone and not connected to your community, to your tribe, right? So I think that's really, really important to have, and also community, not just amongst our own species, our sense of connection with each other, but it's beyond that. We're not alone, just as people, there is a broader community that we can connect to and feel like we're not alone. There's something greater. We're all interconnected, So the community of, I'm sure there's birders here, you feel like you're out there with these families that you can relate to, right? And the trees, we can relate to the trees because they're in communities, they're in groves, they're all interacting and caring for their own, caring for their young. And so it's just relating to others to have that sense of belonging. So that's where I find this work in nature, to have that, and also to share it, all together. And so that's what's really, really beautiful.
Profound. On to you. Other questions from the audience about gnomes or other things? Yes. Do either of you work with children? Duncan?
I currently don't work with children yet, but I have in the past. I used to teach improvisation acting to children, and I'm really excited to start integrating that right now. Right now, it's mostly adult audience because I feel like I myself want to connect to that kind of mindfulness experience that you can only have when you're have an advanced or brain stage in your life. So, but I think there's incredible opportunity with kids, because you look at kids and play in nature is just comes so naturally to them, and so you can really learn a lot from kids.
Absolutely, and Shelburne Farms does amazing things. Steve, do you want to add anything?
I do stuff with children in my own family, nieces and nephews, and I have, for about 25 years, I hired young people to work on the farm with me in crews. So I got a lot of experience that way, and it was a really, really interesting experience, taking young people from age, the youngest who ever came to work for me was 10, to when they, right through to when they graduate from high school. And both giving them the experience of being out of doors and working with the crew, and also just learning actually what it is to work, what it is to apply yourself to a particular set of practices where you're trying to master the ability of using a pruning knife, for instance, and stick with it instead of stopping and picking strawberries every 2 minutes. Although some of that is all right too. But the other thing is that in the neighborhood, for 40 years I've lived as part of a community where I have many, many friends and neighbors whose children help their parents harvest their firewood on my tree farm every fall. So I go out either with a roll of plastic ribbon or a paint gun, and I mark the trees that are basically failing and declining, and those come out and go into the firewood pile. So, Dad and Mom work cutting the trees down and blocking them up, and little Teddy, who's this high, stacks the brush, picks the wood up, throws it into the trailer, and that happens, this repeats itself year after year after year, so that it becomes, those experiences are important beyond measure. They become the stuff of that person's life. And that little boy, Teddy, who was this size, is a building contractor now and does carpentry work for me. But he has a sense of connection to that land and that landscape that manifests in all kinds of ways. And he brings his friends out and shows them where he pruned Christmas trees and where Steve had him plant the birch clump on his first day on the job. So it's a basis for a common history that we have that means a great deal to me. And I know it means a great deal to them too.
Anything else? Just don't want to leave you guys out. Yes, in the back. And I'll repeat these questions.
I'm struck by the scale from which you both work, and it's a very intimate kind of thing. Those 44 rows of trees you can walk in an afternoon. And I suspect many of us are in despair of what's happening with mega agriculture, right, where farmers may be tending crops of thousands of acres. And so they've lost that connection, that really personal kind of thing that allows the level of observation you're making and real personal connection with individual trees even. I wonder if you see anything out there going on that would counteract that, would help those folks that have these mega farms slow down and think about the connection with nature that might make a change in their practice.
So just for the video, I think the question is, there are mega farms where people are losing a personal connection that clearly these two gentlemen have. Are there ways that the mega farms can also connect? in a way that might even change their practices. Is that close enough? Thank you very much for the question. Steve?
Sometimes I feel like what's going on out there in the world around us is a little bit like a magic show where somebody's getting you to watch certain things but not to look at other things. And I think it's important to look at the things that are maybe not quite as visible or not quite as much in the news, because there's a lot of really wonderful stuff that is happening with people who are working very hard, trying to do agriculture, trying to do forestry, trying to do various ecological enterprises in good ways, and to rethink some of the traditional understandings that we have had that maybe have allowed us to survive as a species, but which have in the main been pretty harmful and reduced a lot of fertile land to desert and so forth. So I think that there's all kinds of good and interesting and exciting stuff going on, you know, by very hardworking young farmers and practitioners, and a lot of it in Vermont. And there's a lot of stuff that's pretty dismal to watch and pretty tragic, not just for the landscape, but for the people whose lives are so tied up and whose so many freedoms have been lost for them because they are in such financial hot water and maybe existing, some of them even in a form of slavery, you know, where all of the terms and the conditions under which they farm are set and predetermined by the people who are buying their products. And so that it isn't the yeoman farmer who gets up and makes his or her own choices and decisions about how they're going about doing things, but they're totally in the harness, and that's a tragedy. And a very real one. And I see it happening even in my own neighborhood. So I see a curious and a confusing mixture of good and bad and hopeful and not so hopeful.
Well, yeah, it's like it's all market driven, right? It's like these farms, they need to survive, and they're adapting. And so I mean, the ways that we can help this is, you know, we vote with our dollars. So you know your farmer, right? And in Vermont is leading the way. You know, ever since, I mean, we look at Shelburne Farms, you know, it's like we have this history of having these innovative agricultural practices, and we're going to continue to do that. And that's why Vermont is such an amazing state. And so we vote with our dollars. We know the farmers, and we're going to support those farmers, you know. And the local food movement is a really, really valuable thing. Yeah, places like the Intervale is like a really amazing place. You know, you do these CSAs, and I think we can make a change, definitely.
Okay. I'm going to ask a final question of these two gentlemen. It's been terrific. And clearly, being in nature, it helps, as your science, as you were talking about before, helps depression, helps with stress, helps with chronic pain, I read. pretty remarkable. But to be in a real relationship with nature in a deeper way of knowing is not necessarily that common. Final thoughts on how we can really upgrade the quality of our relationship with nature. Let nature be our guide, which is the name of this, and even tap into Earth's wisdom. So final thoughts about how we as individuals or as a species can really tap in. You want to start?
I think just starting to ask yourselves that question is the beginning, you know? So it's, we all have our own connection right now, and I imagine we all want to, you know, see if we can go even deeper. And so there are, you know, things we can do. And they are experimenting with different kind of mindfulness practices outside, and really listening to slowing down and being open and receptive to what nature is telling us. But I think, you know, we can go way out into the wild, for like a 5-day hike, or like, you know, deep into the wild to try to be connected, or we could bring it back to, like, you know, going out to for a picnic for the day, or we could bring it back even closer and closer and closer to going for a walk in your you know, your neighborhood forest, to getting plants in your house, you know, having nature imagery all around, just immersing yourself in nature and bringing it back, and even experimenting with, you know, you don't have to go out into the wild to connect. You close your eyes when you're about to go to sleep, and you just recall those times that we've had, you know, as a child. Just thinking about nature has wonderful effects. And then just knowing, just keeping in mind, we're not separate from nature. We are nature. So those things, I think we can all find ways to just continue to be immersed in nature and experiencing it with curiosity and with an open mind.
Thank you. Keeping it top of mind. Steve, you want to add
Well,
to
I just want to underline
enriching our quality of
the things that you
relationship.
said, and particularly the thing about separateness. And it's really hard. I think it's hard to grow up in this culture, as wonderful as it is in many ways, and I do think it is. We're raised with what I think of as a habit of separateness, of thinking of ourselves as not connected to, but separate from. And crossing that line inside of ourselves, I think, is necessary, and it can be a little bit embarrassing and uncomfortable doing it. It's like me with the bloody nose out in the Christmas tree field, and I guess I share that with you because you're unlikely to do anything as foolish as that. And if I was willing to do something that foolish, then you can take a little risk too and go sit in your backyard. And if you're thinking about, you know, doing some landscaping work, taking a few trees out, planting a few other trees, a flower bed, a garden here and there, try just going and sitting and being very quiet and saying either silently or out loud, I'd like to be connected to the spirits of this place. And just sit there for a minute and see if anything happens, if anything comes into your mind. And what I generally do after I make a sort of an invocation or an invitation like that is I'll get up and just start moving around a little bit and doing simple mechanical things, picking up stones and making a little cairn, you know, picking up twigs and building something out of them, tidying things up a little bit. And what I'll usually end that kind of invocation with, or invitation with, the words, "Talk to me through my thoughts." And as soon as I do that, my mind just starts running. And somebody says, well, how about a maple tree over there in that corner? And, and the landscape starts putting itself together in various kinds of scenarios. And it doesn't mean you have to jump up and start doing it, because I think for me, the fun of it is starting doing very simple, repetitious, mechanical things, but doing it with a sense of joy at being there, and a sense of not being alone and not being separated, but more connected than you probably have the power to imagine, except as that becomes the habit of mind rather than the habit of mind that is built around separateness. I think you'll start to feel that sense of connectedness more readily and look forward to it, and so that it gets to be not a burden to go out and do yard work, but a great joy. And you know, we've been using the word conversation, and it is a kind of conversation, and it's a conversation as much of actions as of words.
Yeah, I just want to add, also, I think it is giving yourself the opportunity to be experiencing nature. And really, we're all really, I imagine, we're busy, right? We're busy with our screens, we're busy with our jobs, we're busy with the activities that we have. So we all, I mean, we lead really busy lives. So it's just taking that time and give yourself that time to experience nature, and also experience it through all of the senses, right? So it's not, we really rely on vision a lot. So what is it like to close your eyes for 20 minutes and listen to nature, right? Or what is it like to just touch everything, right? Touch and feel, experience nature through touch. So, and what is it like, you know, to taste nature, to taste the, so I make teas from foraged plants, or, you know, taste the plants if you're with someone who's a forager who knows what plants to eat. But, you know, experiencing not just through vision, but through all the senses that we know of, right? And then there are other senses that we can sense spirituality, we can sense all that stuff that hasn't been defined yet by science, but that doesn't mean that we don't feel it. So I would say give yourself that time to go out and do it, and imagine that it's going to be a really well worth your time. It's going to be really a good thing to do for your own well-being. So,
Thank you. Very inspiring, very different from the separate conquer, plunder of the past, and maybe we are all moving forward, and we will be discussing this on different levels over next Wednesday night, and then 2 Wednesdays from that. But this was such a beautiful talk about nature and our connection to it. Duncan Murdoch and Steve Parker, thank you so much for taking us to this special place.
thank you. Thank you.
And just quickly, I want to again thank Shelburne Farms, Shelburne Museum, All Souls Interfaith Gathering, where the next 2 conversations will be. They will not be here. They're over at All Souls. And the Pierson Library and the Vermont Humanities Council, also RETN, who have been with us from the beginning for the last 6 years. And actually, they have 6 years of these series on their website. If you put your name and email on the table over there, they will send you directly a link to this recording, and you will easily find other recordings of this series. So next week, explore the crossroads of religions and beliefs, and the relationship across those differences at All Souls next Wednesday night. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Fran Stoddard. Good evening.